Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 3 of Introduction to Sociology. This chapter is titled Methods of Studying Sociology. And in this chapter, it's kind of a long one, so I'll try to cover everything as best as I can in this video. There are actually 7 learning objectives we're going to try to touch on. So first, we're going to try to evaluate different types of knowledge. Secondly, we're going to summarize the steps that make up the research process. Third, we're going to propose what a sociological study will look like following each of the steps in the research process. Then we're going to compare and contrast different types of social research and determine when each type of sociological research is appropriate to use that method. Fifth, we're going to discuss the issue of whether or not sociology should be considered a science. Then we're going to have a discussion about the ethical issues for doing sociological research. And finally, we're going to identify the role that professional sociologists play and look at how sociology is useful, even to non-sociologists. Okay, so let's dive in. First, we're going to discuss whose knowledge is most worth, or how do we evaluate types of knowledge. So people kind of arrive at knowledge and beliefs through different routes. They have different notions of what reality is, and this can vary greatly. A lot of times people have complete opposite ideas about reality from one another. And so when we think about this, where do we get our ideas about reality from? Well, a lot of our ideas about reality come from different sources. Some sources include authority, experience, cultural tradition, faith, the mass media, and science. So just to touch on those briefly, authority is a knowledge that you just have because someone in a position of power tells you that that's true. It could be a religious authority, a political authority, an economic authority. So if your boss tells you, you have to believe this, okay, I'm going to do it because that's what my boss told me to do. If the government tells you, all right, this is true, believe us, we're the government, you believe it because they said it, right? So that's authority-based knowledge. The second type of knowledge we can look at is experiential knowledge. This is knowledge that you have based on your own everyday life, things that you've observed, things that you've done, things that you've seen, things that you've personally witnessed. That's your firsthand everyday experience. We also have tradition, cultural tradition. You can look at something based on the wisdom of the past. What does people in your community, think of this issue? How is this taught according to your culture and to your society? Another way of looking at knowledge is faith. And this is something that you just believe something without there being proof. You can't see it, you can't experience it, you can't touch it or feel it or taste it or smell it, but you believe in it. It's something that's unknown, that's beyond the power of our experiences. Another source of knowledge, and this is kind of similar to, maybe authority or cultural tradition, is the media. You believe that the media is telling you the truth. Now, I would say it's kind of similar to authority because the media itself is presented as an authority. The people on the news, the newspapers, the articles they write, the people on TV news present themselves as being an authority on the truth. So that's their sort of role. Finally is the knowledge of science. Science uses empirical knowledge, meaning that it's based on something that you can test with your senses, with your sensory perception and things you can observe in the natural, physical, material world. Okay, so that's the first learning objective we talked about, is the question of knowledge, the different types of knowledge. Okay, move on to the next section, is the research process. Now, the research process is kind of what we would think of as the scientific method. And there are sort of different steps and ways of accomplishing a study in the natural world. So the different steps that go into the research process, a lot of people might debate whether to use this or that, but here's the kind of common steps we would use in a research process. First step is you would define the problem, or define what it is you want to question, what you want to study. So you would have to find some social issue of interest to you. And therefore, you would have to define how you are going to study that topic. Now, this leads to two very important points. The first one is we have things that are called variables in science. A variable is something that varies. In other words, it's something that changes in some ways, right? And in sociology, the variables we're looking at are different aspects of society that you can change, that you can observe that they change, and therefore you can measure them. Okay, so divorce would be a social issue you could study. Why? Because divorce changes. Different societies have different rates of divorce. And the divorce rate changes over time, historically versus all the way up to the present. You'll see different rates of divorce. So that is a variable. Divorce is something that varies between people and societies and cultures, and you can study it. You can measure it some way. So this leads to the second concept of a variable, which is the operational definition. And we use this big term, operationalization. Whenever you're studying something, you have to have a definition for the term that allows you to measure it. So you can't just, so if someone, let's pick the example of divorce, you can't just say, oh, divorce is, whatever I feel like it is, because then every person that studies divorce could study that term meaning something completely different. Well, okay, well, how are you going to actually measure divorce? And you might say, oh, my measure of divorce is based on obtaining divorce certificates that were issued by the state. So you have a measure of what a divorce is, right? Another way, how else could you measure divorce? Well, you might just use word of mouth. You might interview some people, do a survey, and ask them, hey, have you ever been divorced? And they'll say, yeah, I was divorced, right? So that would be a different way of how you measure the divorce rate. You could look at documents from courts and government agencies that announce the divorce legally. You might ask them on a survey were they divorced or not. So that's a question of operationalization. You have an operational definition. That means for the study, you've defined how you're going to study it, what you're going to measure. Okay, the next step in the research process. So again, we said the first step was defining your variables, defining the problem you're going to study. The second step is conduct a literature review. Now, a literature review means that you want to ground your research in the work of people who've come before you. You're not the first person to study divorce. There's been a whole centuries, years of research of other social scientists who have studied the phenomenon of divorce. So what you're going to do with the literature review is you go and read all that literature. Or you don't have to read all of it, of course, but you go through and see what other people have written about, what other studies have found, what conclusions they've reached. That's the literature review. Okay, now, once you have done your research review, literature review, you will then determine the research question. You will develop the research question. Now, looking at the literature helps you defining your variables, you're researching what other people have said about this and what other studies have found. And this kind of helps you refine what your actual research question is. And you're going to, when you do a research question, you're going to set things up according to how you're going to study it. There's two major ways. First is quantitative, the second is qualitative, all right? So in a quantitative study, that's something that you can measure using some sort of numerical value, like mathematical value of some sort. And a quantitative study is going to use a hypothesis where you will state how you believe that the relationship goes between the variables. The divorce rate and the level of crime or something. I don't know. You pick variables and you will make a statement, a hypothesis of what you think the relationship is. And then you're going to test the hypothesis to see what kind of relationship you have between these variables. Right. The other way of doing research is called qualitative. Qualitative is something you study looking at a more informal, non-mathematical way. You might sit down and interview people. In qualitative, you're trying to find the meaning behind something. You're looking more of the value and meaning and belief that the participants in the social experience, how they think of it themselves. So you might go visit a group of people who are divorced and hang out with them and see how they live their lives. You might interview people and do some conversations with them about what it feels like to be divorced. So that's a qualitative research study. It's looking at the quality of what is like to be divorced, whereas quantitative would look at the data. What is the divorce rate over time? Is it higher among white people, Black people, Asian, Latino? Is it higher for men or for women? Does it depend on what state you live in? What city? Are you rural? Are you urban? Are you living in the suburbs? It would look at economic. Do rich people or poor people have divorces more likely, right? So you would have to look at large scale data sets, numbers, use statistics. That would be how you would answer a research question using quantitative methods. Okay. So then we would move on to the section of how to collect data. After you've done your design and decided what kind of research you want to do, quantitative, qualitative, all of that, you're going to have to collect some data. Now, in quantitative research, we use what is called sampling. Now, this is a method in statistics. You have a population and you take a small sample from that population because the population is too large for you to study the whole thing. So let's say you want to study the divorce rate in the United States. Well, there's 300 million people in the United States, and there's probably millions of people who have, been divorced. You're not going to be able to interview or survey or get data on every single one of those millions of people. So you have to take a sample. That means you take a smaller subset of that population to study it. Now, there's different ways you can do the sample. The most common one is a random sample, because again, you don't want to be biased in your sample. You don't want to only pick people in the sample that will tell you what you want to hear. And then after you've collected the data, your next step in the research process is to analyze the data. And typically in quantitative research, you analyze the data by converting the data into numbers and then running it through statistical tests. A simple way of is getting the average, the mean, the median, the mode, something like that. In qualitative research, it's more of what we call a content analysis. Content analysis is where you kind of go through and read and look for patterns and different conclusions based on the meaning. So let's say you're doing divorce as your study in a qualitative research. You would basically sit down and interview a bunch of people who have been divorced and do a focus group or something, let's say. And then to analyze the data, you would read over the transcript from that interview or from that focus group, and you would go through and see what are the common themes, what are the common patterns, how many people mentioned this thing is why they got divorced and they felt like this about divorce. And then you start seeing these patterns, and then you realize, oh, that's the meaning behind what divorce is for people, right? So that's qualitative research, how you would do that. And then finally, you would analyze the implications of the study, draw some conclusions. Now, your research, again, there's always limitations. So you would have to say what the limitations are. Again, you can't study every single person that's been divorced in the whole country, and you can't study every single person that's been divorced in the whole world or throughout all of human history. You can only study what you saw in your sample. So you have to make a extrapolation of you take, okay, my research in my one study on this sample found this, so I'm going to assume that this implies that this is true about divorces for the population as a whole. And so you're sort of making a general statement, a general conclusion based on the limited research that you've done. And there's always a limitation. So you have to leave an area open for future research. Say, what were some of the limitations? What do you think you could find more detail on? What is something that future studies could delve into in a more deeper way than you were able to, right? So that's where you look at your limitation, because there's always, 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 always a limitation in any sort of scientific research. Okay, so let's move on to our next section of our learning objectives. And here we're going to look at the different types of sociological research. Okay, so we're going to look at first is exploratory research. Exploratory research is when there's something new that you want to study that hasn't really been studied before, a new program that the government put in place, and you want to study whether that was working, right? A new institution opened up, a nonprofit is putting together a new program, a school is putting a new program in place. A company is putting a new program in place, and they want to see if it worked or not. That's exploratory research. Descriptive research is the second type. And description is just sort of describing the social reality, just providing facts about the society that you're looking at. You could be describing a fact about a behavior, about attitudes, like what is the average American's attitude about LGBT people. You might look at statistics on that. So it's really just sort of describing what percentage of the population thinks this, what a percentage thinks that. It's just a basic description. Another type of research that goes beyond description is called explanatory research. Explanatory research is just, you're not just describing a phenomenon, you want to go deeper and explain why things happen or why things don't happen. So you're here looking at kind of a cause and effect relationship between things. Again, let's say divorce. What is the cause? You're not just describing, 35% of married couples divorced. You're not just saying a description. You're saying, well, what is the cause? What factors led to that percentage of people getting divorced? And those are kind of the main types of research that you can do in sociology. All right, let's move on to our next learning objective, sociology and science. So this is a question: is sociology a science? Now, we've been saying in this class that sociology is, yes, it is a science. But the question that some people have, and the debate that some sociologists have, is that can a social science be the same as a natural science or a physical science, right? The way that we study chemistry and particles and atoms, can we use those same methods and apply them to human beings? Do human societies really work in the same way? Can they be studied in the same way? Is it even ethical for us to try to study people the same way we would study inanimate objects? And that's the question in sociology. Now, that's why you have different types of sociology. That's why you have quantitative, which sticks closer to scientific methods. And then you have qualitative sociology, qualitative, which is more about interpretation and meaning. And so that's in some ways closer to perhaps something like journalism or literature or something. You're not as rigorously adhering to a deep scientific method in that pure sense. So that's the debate in sociology, is can it be the same science in the same way that physical science is a science? Now, let's move on to the next learning objective. And this is the topic of ethical issues in social research. Now, there's a big controversy about ethics in sociology, because in the early days of science, ethics were frequently abused. And the people that we did our research on, research subjects or the research participants we used in our studies, would typically be experimented on, where we would give them certain drug treatments or, use things on them that would traumatize them, violate their privacy, violate their confidentiality and their safety, all for getting some kind of scientific result. And there are very numerous famous cases in the early 20th century of scientists who have done super unethical things onto our human research subjects. And that is why the question today is, how should we ethically conduct research as sociologists? Typically nowadays, we have institutional review boards at colleges. These are institutional review boards. You have to gain approval from them in order to conduct a study with human subjects. And they will evaluate what you're doing in the study to make sure that you're not doing anything that will violate the rights of the people you're studying. Okay, and then let's move on to the next learning objective, which is the occupational and personal uses of sociology. Now, sociology is not only used by and for sociologists. The kind of skills and knowledge and information we gain in sociology is used by all types of people in different jobs and fields and careers and different walks of life. So this is kind of, this section is kind of about what are some of the different ways you can use sociology knowledge. The primary way we talk about is kind of academic sociology professors, and they are working as teachers primarily at universities and colleges and schools, and also as researchers. And what they do is kind of study, they're the ones who do the main primary research, education, and knowledge in the field of sociology. Another type of sociologists are applied social sociologists who work in the workforce. Now, these are people that do sort of evaluation for different projects at a company, right? You might have, one example is marketing research. Now, whenever a company wants to know, did its product sell? Let's say Hollywood produces a movie. They want to see, what's the audience think of that movie? They'll conduct surveys, they'll conduct focus groups, they'll ask the audience, did you prefer the movie like this, or do you want a movie that ends like that? Do you want this type of movie? Do you want that? Do you think this actor is funny? Do you like that actor? Right? So this is one applied type of research sociologists can do that's outside of like the universities and the academy. Another type of research could just be working for a nonprofit or a government agency or even a corporation, and the corporation has a specific policy they implement, or the nonprofit implements a new program, the government agency has a new law that was in place, and they want to study the effect of the law and how it worked out. So that's one way you can do it. There's also, of course, clinical uses of sociology. You can have social workers and things like that that are in healthcare, therapy, and things of that nature. So that's a main way that you can look at sociology. And of course, even if you're not formally a sociologist doing research for education, for your workplace, for the media, for the marketing, everyday people need to rely on sociological knowledge in order to understand and make good decisions about the world. So whatever your career, whatever walk of life you're in, whatever you're doing with your life, it is important to be informed about society and how society works and what society is, because we all live in society. Okay, so in conclusion, we summed up all the different types of research methods in sociology. First, we evaluated what the different types of knowledge are. Second, we went over the steps in the research process and looked at how a sociological study could be pursued using those steps. With this case, divorce was the example I just threw out at the top of my head. We also did a compare and contrast of the different types of social research, quantitative, qualitative, to determine which one is more effective and in terms of what kind of study you want to do. And then finally, and then next we looked at whether sociology is a science in the same way that physical sciences are. We also talked about the ethical issues of social research, and we identified the role that professionals and non-professionals how they can use sociology in their lives. Until next time.